Hello, and thank you for joining us today for Huron's webinar on gene therapy, the perfect storm for integrated cross-functional approaches, hosted alongside Pharmafocus. My name is Angela Cottrell, and I'm the Events and Production Director for pharmaceutical publishers Samadan Limited, whose portfolio includes the monthly newspaper Pharmafocus and its sister website pharmafile.com. Today we're joined by Huron's Senior Director, Dr. Akshay Kumar, Director Francois Lucas, and Manager Maya Karana, who will discuss the need and introduce frameworks for integrated cross-functional approaches imperative to driving patient access and commercial success. They will also show examples of how these frameworks can be applied to address the commercialization challenges of these disruptive therapies. Just a few housekeeping points before we begin. You're welcome to submit questions at any point during the webinar, and we will try our best to answer as many as possible during the question and answer session at the end. If your question is not answered in the running time, you'll have the opportunity to add any comments or questions in our feedback survey afterwards. The webinar will be made available for download shortly after the session has finished. I'd now like to hand over to our first speaker, Francois Lucas, to open the webinar.
Good morning and good afternoon, everybody. Well, let me first introduce Huron. We are a global consulting group specializing in life sciences and catering for pharma, biotech, and medtech companies. What we do is to support clients on many aspects of their business, and that's, it could be clinical, regulatory, commercial aspects related to market access, or capability building. So what's relevant today is that our team members have a solid hands-on experience with cell and gene therapies. First, let me introduce the speakers. I'm myself, Francois Lucas. I've been working for more than 20 years in the consulting business for pharma and biotech, with a particular focus on market access to innovative health technologies across the globe. And that includes gene therapies and treatment for rare diseases. With me is my colleague Akshay Kumar. He is a senior director at Huron with over 12 years of consulting experience. For the past 5 years, has been helping a number of companies with cell and gene therapies to go to market and build up good strategies and implementation. And last but not least, my colleague Maya. She's a clinical pharmacist by background and has been working in the cell and gene therapy space for, I think, a few years now, supporting clients with developing their business models for these therapies. So I'd like to summarize what we're trying to achieve today. First, we'll provide you with some context about the cell and gene therapies. We will highlight what's unique in these complex transformational technologies, and specifically what barriers exist to patient accessing these therapies. Then we'll move on to looking back at what has happened on the market over the past 5 years, looking at how pioneering companies have tried to address the access challenges for the cell and gene therapy products. Lastly, we'll reflect on how at Huron we see the best ways to developing the go-to-market strategies for these disruptive technologies, and we believe that these cell and gene therapies create a perfect storm for both industry and healthcare systems. So we do believe that the response to that should be to move away from traditional approaches and really focusing on this value chain, very highly complex value chains, and devising integrated solutions at various pain points along this value chain. So let's briefly characterize cell and gene therapies without going into a lecture, given the time constraints. Basically, what we mean by cell and gene therapies is approaches that manipulate the genetic materials and then are implanted back into the patient. So to be very simplistic, we can divide these therapies into groups. One is could be called allogenic cell and gene therapies. That involves, they are basically a product in the vial. So the genetic materials from a donor source is inserted into a vehicle, usually a viral vector, and that's administered to the patient. And this is inside the body of the patient that the genetic materials multiplies itself. So in that sense, it's in vivo manipulation, if you wish. In contrast, autologous approaches involves harvesting the patient's own cells. They are manipulated externally outside the body. The genome is manipulated ex vivo, and then the materials are put back into the patient. So that's obviously a more complex and cumbersome delivery approach for this second group. If you look at the pipelines, development pipelines of cell and gene therapies, over the past 17 years or so, there is obviously a great number of trials being approved as high intense activity. Most of it is in oncology, but not exclusively in it. But a key number, if you want to remember, is that prediction is that by 2022, in 3 years from now, you may have 40 gene therapies, cell and gene therapies approved and then launching to the market. That's a great number of them, with the hope that they will be transformational and bringing either a cure or something that looks like a cure. So there's a lot of excitement about these therapies. However, despite the potential to transform patient outcomes, there are definitely access barriers to these disruptive technologies. In a simple way, I think we can group them into categories. One is the group of factors related to technology itself, the product, and the other factors are more related to environment, to the ecosystem of the healthcare delivery. So if you look at the factors linked to the technology itself, obviously the manufacturing process is highly complex, and it leads to costs of production, manufacturing that are much higher than what the industry has been used to. So that's a very important consideration, and part of it is linked to the fact that it's a complex, evolving, rapidly innovating technological platform. An example is CRISPR, that also involved intensive efforts for quality control, and assays have been developed. Assays have been developed to control for quality and monitor it, but they are still not fully established. To look at the evidence that has been acquired past decades or 2 decades about the efficacy to safety ratio. First concern that has been generated in the past has been about the viral vector itself. Viruses can multiply rapidly inside the body, and they potentially lead to adverse events. And the industry is obviously working very hard to look at this and find solutions and mitigate any effects. Another consideration is the impact of the genetic manipulation itself. And if you look at the early findings in this area in the past, they've been concerned about the oncogenesis potential for genetic manipulation, as well as the potential genotoxicity. Again, the industry is very aware of this, and as well as the regulators, and solutions are being developed for that. But maybe you have to put in balance the efficacy against the safety aspect. The efficacy could be potentially huge. There's potential for curative, durable, huge health benefits to the patients. However, the question, and maybe the $1 million question is it a one-time, one-off curative therapies, or would the patient need to be retreated in the future? That's really an open question for a number of therapies. So if you look at what the challenges the developer would find when they launch a product, it will be linked to evidence at launch. So there would be probably one-arm trial with relatively small size of patient, relatively short-term duration, 1 or 2 years. Obviously, this evidence is not enough to assess the potential for long-term durable efficacy and look at the long-term safety aspects. And that's a challenge that the industry is very aware of. If you look at now at the second group of factors that's related to environment, to the ecosystem of healthcare system, first, the delivery infrastructure needs to be able to deliver smoothly these new technologies. That first requires that centers, specialist centers, are identified and qualified, certified to deliver the delivery and to monitor the patient. Then the staff within these treatment centers need to be trained to the new technology. That requires significant investment. And then you need to have enough capacity for these centers to deliver the technology. And if you think that there might be only a few treatment centers to deliver the technology to patients throughout the country or the regions or from outside the countries, there might be some serious limitation to capacity output of the centers. But maybe as important is the referral network. How would the patients be identified and then, if eligible, be referred to a treatment centers? That requires a pathway, a network. In most cases, they will not be fully established, or if they are established, the motivation to activate them, to operate them, might be insufficient for various practical reasons. Even assuming that the delivery of this technology is sorted out, you have big challenges from the payer perspective, the reimbursement. The first one is that the HTA approaches are not really adequate for cell and gene therapies. They're adequate not only to value them, but also to support appropriate decision for reimbursement. If you look at what practices is in most countries, the requirement from HTA bodies to have long-term trials, usually with head-to-head comparisons with a significant number of patients. All this would be really challenges for cell and gene therapies. Therefore, there's really scope for an adaptation of the HTA framework and some progress on that front. But even if you have a framework that's appropriate, you still have the issue that most likely the technology would lead to a high cost per patient and a really high cost that, in principle, should be paid up front. Especially if you consider a technology that's a one-off technology. How can you pay for, as an example, $1 million per patient in one go? That's something that the peer systems are not used to. But if you go a bit beyond the patient cost, if you look at the overall impact on the budget at the population level, if you think of scenarios when you have multiple therapies, and I mentioned before, 40 cell and gene therapies in the market in 3 years, and if the patient's population targeted by these technologies is substantial, you can imagine that you have a very high budget impact, and it might happen within a short time frame. Again, this is challenging to the healthcare system. But maybe if you go a bit more granular in how a patient gets access to reimbursed therapy, in that case, it's not clear how it's done. In that case, it could be very burdensome. As an example, at present, it's still very much a case-by-case approach to assess the medical needs for the patient, eligibility for the patient to access therapies, and actually activate reimbursement. That's really something that both industry and payers need to work on. I now will hand over the talk to my colleague Maya, who is going to reflect on what the industry has done so far in the past few years in the area of cell and gene therapies.
Great, thanks, Francois. So we've talked a lot about the barriers, we've talked about the challenges, opportunities associated with cell and gene therapies. What we want to do in this section is take an aerial snapshot of what has happened so far, and then spend a little bit more time and select some products and really talk about their market access strategy and talk about some of the strengths and the areas for improvement. So here on this slide, we've got a timeline from 2012 to 2018. And what we've done here is we've mapped out some of the cell and gene therapy products that have been approved over the last 6 years. On the left side of the timeline, we see that Glybera was approved by EMA in 2012. It's worth mentioning that there was little commercial success with Glybera, and the product was withdrawn from the market in 2017. Then on the right side, we see a cluster of products that were approved from 2016 to 2018. So we've got Strimvelis by GSK, Lexterna by Sparks, and the more recent launches like Yescarta and Kymria. And when we really look at the timeline and we look at how the companies have thought about bringing these products into the market, we do see a degree of evolution. So with Glybera, we saw more of the traditional pricing and reimbursement approach that was used, and that landed the product with a pretty heavy price tag. And then with the more recent launches like Lexterna and Strimvelis, we are seeing that the pharma companies are thinking more holistically about the challenges associated with bringing these products into the market. And they are working more closely with payers to really identify what some of these barriers are, to figure out how to remove the bottlenecks and to really enable patient access for these technologies. So let's take a look at Strimvelis in a little bit more detail. So Strimvelis is a GSK product, and that was indicated for ADA SCID, which is an extremely rare disorder. It was approved by EMA in April 2016 at a list price of 594,000 euros per treatment cycle. Now, what GSK did with IFA is that they entered into an arrangement where Strimvelis was only going to be delivered at Hospital San Raffaele in Milan. So all patients across the world requiring access to Strimvelis had to travel to Hospital San Raffaele for therapy. So that was their delivery agreement with IFA. Now, here on the slide on the left, we've got the key payer uncertainties that were raised by IFA. And on the right, we've got aspects of the managed access agreement that GSK developed in collaboration with IFA for Strimvelis. So if we start from the top there, one of the main payer uncertainties with Strimvelis was, not new knowledge to most of us, is the high upfront cost, the heavy price tag. And to help address that payer uncertainty, GSK offered staggered payment program where IFA could pay GSK over a course of 2 to 3 years for the therapy. So that lowered some of that burden associated with a really high upfront cost. Then in addition to that, IFA was also not sure if the treatment was actually going to work. They were not sure if it was going to work. They weren't sure if it was going to work. Would it actually last? The durability was in question. So to address the outcomes-related uncertainties, what GSK did is that it entered a pay-for-performance agreement with IFA. And they also set up a long-term registry to collect data in the long run for patients that were given Strimvelis, so they're able to collect some data and have evidence for the durability potential of the product. And then last but not the least, because all the patients, as I mentioned, had to actually travel to Hospital San Raffaele for treatment, there were additional payer and caregiver travel costs associated with the use of Strimvelis. And what GSK did here is that they worked with a patient support group to help channel some of that funding to support the additional travel costs with patients and caregivers traveling to San Raffaele for therapy. So GSK did a really good job, actually, of thinking about the key payer uncertainties, working very closely with IFA to figure out what these are and how to actually address them using a managed access agreement. But despite that, they were not able to hit the commercial expectations that the analysts had when Strimvelis was launched. So not every patient that should have been eligible for therapy was actually able to receive Strimvelis. And the main reason for that was cross-border funding. So funding across, different countries, the routes were not established, and it was really a new area for the payers and for GSK as well. So that created some dent in the commercial success for the product because there was no established reimbursement pathways and people weren't sure how they would get funding in their native country if they were to travel to Italy for therapy. There was some limitation on patient access from that perspective. Now, let's look at another example. Let's talk about Lexterna. So Lexterna is a product by Sparks Therapeutics. It was developed in collaboration with the Children's Hospital of Philadelphia, and it is for the treatment of a congenital retinal disorder that causes progressive blindness. Now, Lexterna is the first in vivo allogeneic gene therapy, and the trials actually showed a significant improvement in vision for those that were enrolled in the trial, but it did not classify as a cure. Now, despite the stellar clinical performance in the trials, Sparks was aware that they would need to really take a much more multidimensional approach towards access to make sure that their product is adopted in the market. So here we've got 4 aspects of their market access strategy. So again, some of the things are actually quite similar to Strimvela. So they did look into doing an outcomes-based reimbursement as well. Here, there was a partial rebate for payers if patients failed to meet specified efficacy threshold first at 30 to 90 days. That's more short-term. And then again, to demonstrate durability at the 30-month mark. Then they also looked into doing an annuity-based payment program, and this was to address the upfront high cost density issue associated with the heavy price tag. They also looked at capping the out-of-pocket cost to address the patient affordability issues. And then lastly, specific to their strategy in the US, they actually looked at bypassing the buy and bill pathway and actually entering into contracting agreements with specialty pharmacies to deliver their product. So what this did was that it helped eliminate the drug transit, storage, and handling risks that are associated with the treatment facilities, and this is very specific to their US market access strategy. Now again, this is also a very different way of looking at the market access strategy in the US, bypassing the buy and bill. They address some of those cost density issues, they address payer affordability issues, but there were still, again, some challenges primarily associated with the referral pathways that were not very clearly defined in the US to move these patients to funnel these patients across for therapy. And then also the product actually required a specific skill set from a physician perspective to deliver it. And there were not a lot of physicians that were skilled to be able to deliver this product. So we still ended up in a situation where we did not see the commercial success that was predicted by analysts for Lexterna when it was launched. And the main learning here in this section is that, yes, we are seeing pharma companies thinking about access from a more holistic perspective. And we are seeing that they are working closely with payers to really try and identify the challenges and try to think of creative ways moving forward. But one of the most important things is really having that holistic view and how to actually materialize and make it happen. And I will pass over to my colleague Akshay, who will take us into the next section where we'll talk about some of the learnings and the approach to commercialization.
Thank you, Maya. So, as Maya mentioned, with some of the more recent launches like Strimvela and Lexterna, we are seeing some emerging bright spots with companies trying to think of ways of addressing some of the payer challenges that exist. Yet, as Maya emphasized, one of the big challenges has been translating this into patient uptake and ultimately patient access and uptake. And what we're going to do in this section is start learning from some of those experiences and propose a framework by which pharma companies can think more holistically about the value chain as well as across the holistic view of all the different stakeholders that could influence patient access and uptake, and then devise integrated solutions to address these. So the underpinning of our framework requires a thorough understanding and mapping of the entire value chain. Patient access can be influenced by various factors. It could be influenced by the manufacturing and supply chain, identification, referral patterns, the delivery and specialized delivery of these technologies, the financing and the reimbursement, as well as the follow-up. So it's mapping out the entire value chain from start to finish. And then also taking a more holistic view around the different stakeholders. So mapping out every stakeholder that's involved across one or more points in the value chain. So it's not just looking at the payer in isolation, but looking at other stakeholders like the regulator, the referring physician, the provider of these gene therapies, and of course the patient. Once we've got a holistic view of the steps in the value chain as well as the number of stakeholders, it is key to start thinking about where along this value chain do we have pain points for each of these stakeholders. Pain points, by which I mean potential patient drop-off points, and mapping out these pain points. Now, the pain points could be, for example, for payer, could be at multiple process steps. It could be around patient identification. How do you assess the appropriate patient for the therapy? It could be around the delivery. So, for example, with autologous therapies, one of the big challenges is that for the pre-treatment and post-treatment steps in the autologous process, there are DRG tariffs typically coming from the stem cell transplant world, but these tariffs may not be sufficient to cover it. So we have to take that view there as well. And of course, there are things around the financing and follow-up, some of which we've seen Streamwellis and Lexterna addressing to a large extent. But the key message here is map out the value chain, map out every stakeholder that's there or could influence patient drop-off at any step in the value chain, and identify the pain points and the reasons why patients could drop off at each point along the value chain and for each stakeholder. And once we do that, then we can start thinking of solutions that can address either one or more of the pain points across different stakeholders, or for the same stakeholder but across different points of the value chain. So what are the benefits of this approach? I think the key benefit of this approach is we are putting patient access in the center of all our strategy and tactic definition. Patient access is key, and this involves different functions. So it gets all the different functions that could impact patient access on the table working together. So it encourages cross-functional work. And this in turn results in solutions that are lean, integrated solutions that are addressing either one or more pain points for the stakeholder at different points in the value chain, or is addressing the needs of multiple stakeholders at a single point in the value chain. So this gives you a lean set of solutions addressing all of the various pain points. And the benefits of this is greater customer centricity. The patient is of course key, but we are also thinking of all the different stakeholders that could impact patient access, and we are developing solutions to address their pain points. Working in this area, one of the other things which we started to see is it can substantially reduce the time to commercialization and the cost associated around commercialization of the product. What I mean by this is having a lean set of solutions that addresses multiple needs of different stakeholders, or multiple needs of one stakeholder at different points in the value chain, gives you a lean set of solutions which reduces costs, and also it sets you up for success and drives patient access and uptake. And finally, it also encourages companies to take a more platform approach to the technologies. You're building up the infrastructure for either future indication expansion of your platform, gene therapy platform, or for your future gene therapy products in the pipeline. So what I'm going to do now is show you a couple of case studies of where we've applied this framework to address some of the problems our clients have faced around patient access. So the first case study is about gene therapies. This was an allogeneic therapy, and the client came to us because they were facing one problem in their trial, which was retention of patients, either prior to treatment delivery or in the long follow-up phase. So we started to understand what's driving this. So some of the challenges were around the patient identification step. Even though eligible patients were being identified, they were dropping off at this point because the benefits and risks of this therapy weren't being communicated appropriately to them, and there was an asymmetry of knowledge. Even in the delivery process, one of the areas where we found, or one of the causes of patient drop-off was around the physicians. The referring physicians found the whole referral pattern to get these patients onto the drug very burdensome, and potentially when they launch, issues around geographic access could also become a problem. And finally, looking more towards the right-hand side of the slide around patient follow-up, what we found is that there were risks because the follow-up requirements were quite rigorous for this drug, was that patients do not adhere to the follow-up requirements. And some of the reasons behind that could be, that we are ultimately offering a cure for the patient, or at least a potential for a cure. And the incentive for patients to abide and follow by this rigorous follow-up requirements is limited. Similarly, this could have an impact on the payer, because if you start setting up a registry with big gaps in your data set, it's very hard to demonstrate durability and the long-term impact of these treatments, which is a key requirement for the payers. So in this case, we looked at an issue around patient identification, patient delivery, and follow-up, mapped out the different stakeholders that had pain points along this way, and then started to think, could we find a solution that addresses these pain points for all of these different stakeholders in these 3 steps of the value chain? And one of the solutions we came up with was the patient concierge service or a patient case manager. Essentially, what happens here is, as soon as a patient is identified for gene therapy Z, based on patient consent, they are assigned to a patient case manager. This case manager plays multiple roles. One of the initial roles is to educate the patients around the benefits and risks of the drug. They also work with the referring physicians to educate them around the benefits and risks of the treatment and help them navigate some of the access hurdles, say, for example, the geographic access hurdle, and cut down some of the burden around with the referral patterns. In the follow-up stage, so once the patient is given the treatment, the case manager still works with them and continues to work with them. They work with the patients to schedule treatment and follow-ups to abide by the rigorous safety requirements of the drug, as well as they help sign up patients to a community, what they call an alumni patient network. And the benefits of this is the patients start to feel that they are part of a community who received this quite a novel and disruptive treatment. This keeps them more engaged with their follow-up requirements, but it also gives them the confidence that they are not alone. There are others who've gone through that experience and they can interact with each other and share their experiences with each other, which just keeps them engaged in the long follow-up period. So as you can see with this case example, we had one solution, an integrated solution that addressed the needs of 3 different stakeholders around patient retention at 3 steps of the process. So patient identification and qualification in delivery of the treatment, as well as follow-up. Moving on to the second case study now. In this case, gene therapy Y, this is an autologous gene therapy, and the manufacturer came to us saying, what can we do to address some of the financing and access related pain points? So again, we started looking at, what are these pain points? And we started with steps even before financing and access. So one thing was around establishing patient eligibility. As my colleague Francois mentioned, because these are very high cost therapies, payers generally are going to put you through a case-by-case approval process. But this case-by-case approval process is quite time-consuming, and it was critical for the patients of this therapy to get access to the treatment as soon as possible, because this disease had a high mortality rate, or has the potential for high mortality rate. So one of the big pain points where we were seeing drop-offs was delays in the case-by-case approval process. The other area was with referring physicians. Now, because for the case-by-case approval processes, there was a lot of paperwork required. You had to establish medical need. And the amount of paperwork required for this was substantial. In fact, this was cited as one of the key barriers for Glybera's withdrawal from the market as well. One physician who had the first experience of using this treatment found the whole referral process very burdensome and the case-by-case approval process very burdensome. Now, besides this, the other issues were the DRG tariff. There were pre-treatment and post-treatment episodes of this being an autologous therapy required some pre-treatment before the patient's cells could be harvested. The harvested cells were then manipulated and transplanted back in the patient, and that required some follow-up treatment as well. And the current tariffs are based on stem cell transplant and were not adequate to cover these pre-treatment and post-treatment steps. So this was a big barrier for the provider. The other challenges, as my colleague Francois mentioned earlier in the presentation, were around the high cost density for the patient. And given that this was addressing a chronic disease, there is a potential for high budget impact because there was the potential for a large prevalent pool of patients being treated upfront. So the whole bolus of prevalent patients being treated upfront. And thereafter, you would have patients coming on, who are just the incidence group. So payers did raise this concern as well, that how will you address my high budget impact in the first few years of launch? So one of the things we did with gene therapy manufacturer Y was starting to find integrated solutions that addressed one or more of these pain points. The first step was developing a medical needs assessment tool. This drug was going to have a case-by-case approval process where medical need for that patient had to be established. So we started working with some of the bodies that would make this decision. So for example, MDK in Germany, to identify what is the level of evidence they would require in order to facilitate the decision around should a patient receive this treatment or are they not eligible for this treatment. Once we did that, we converted it into a simple template which your referring physicians could then fill out and make this case for medical need. This would cut down some of the burden associated for the referring physician to make the case for gene therapy for their patient. And it provided a checklist, so it would cut down future rejections of applications as well. The other solutions which we looked at were more around managed entry agreements or contracting. And here we tried to address the different pain points as well for the provider as well as for the payer. So we started off with having a staggered introduction to the drug to ensure that the patients with the highest unmet need were treated first. And this helped address the whole concern around the prevalent bolus of patients being treated for this therapy upfront. To address the high cost density, we came up with an annuity payment scheme that would be where the cost of the treatment would be split over 2 to 3 years. And finally, to address some of the providers' concerns around the inadequate DRG tariff for the pre-treatment and post-treatment, we developed a simple rebate that would cover the DRG shortfall for the providers. Hence, it would not be a loss leader for them. It would be cost neutral to deliver these therapies. So from these two case studies, I hope I've been able to demonstrate how taking a cross-functional view to develop integrated solutions could really help. So the key takeaways I would say are that cell and gene therapies offer the promise of transformative clinical outcomes for patients. But to date, the therapies that have launched have failed to hit analyst expectations. And one of the ways to address this and to improve the potential for these therapies going ahead is companies should start taking a view where they put patient access at the center of all their decisions. And patient access defined broadly, it's not just a market access decision, or the market access function has to work with other functions such as regulatory, such as marketing, such as PV, pharmacovigilance, and break away from the traditional approaches and work in a more cross-functional way. And the way to work is understand each step in the value chain where you could have patient drop off and look across the holistic range of stakeholders that could cause these patients to drop off. Identify their pain points and then work in a cross-functional way to develop fully integrated innovative solutions that address these pain points. And given our experience in this area, we think this is key. Work cross-functionally, understand the needs of all of your different stakeholders along each of the steps in the value chain, and develop a lean set of solutions that address the needs of one or more stakeholders at different points of the value chain. Thank you.
Thank you all for sharing your presentation. We'll now move on to the Q&A session. This gives any listeners with a question the opportunity to have it answered today. Our first question is as follows. Based on your experiences of supporting clients, are cross-functional approaches not commonly used for developing product strategy and supporting launch? And how is this unique to cell and gene therapies?
Thanks, Angela. This is Akshay, and I'd like to take this question. I think it's important to say for all products, we always stress the importance of cross-functional working. And for traditional pharma products, they do not require transformative change to the health ecosystem. The benefits of cross-functional working is predominantly around efficiency and alignment of strategy. In cell and gene therapy, however, cross-functional working is imperative, and partly it's driven by the need to transform the health ecosystem, but it's also, in many cases, we are dealing with a wider set of stakeholders who have problems at one or more points along the value chain. So take, for example, the decision to have one delivery and manufacturing center in Europe versus centers across markets. This is more than just a manufacturing and supply chain logistics question in the context of cell and gene therapy. It has implications for market access, for example. Do we need cross-border access pathways to be established? Even from a medical and commercial perspective, how do we drive referral patterns? There are also considerations around legal. What are the IP risks to a technology, especially if it's an autologous therapy? So as you can see, to address this question, there are different functions that have different implications depending on the decision that's been made. And hence, this requires input and solutioning from the different functions to find a solution that ultimately ensures that the right patients are getting access to the drug. So hence, for cell and gene therapies, we believe that it is imperative to work in a cross-functional manner, understand the challenges for all of the different internal stakeholders when making a decision, and then aligning internally and finding an integrated solution that addresses the needs of all of the customers that we are targeting.
Fantastic. Thank you for that comprehensive answer.
Just to add, here, I think the notion that working cross-functionally integrated, it's not new. We agree that it's what should best practice in other areas. It's just the intensity, the complexity, the number of dimensions to look at that makes it a bit special. So each thing is what normally is done, but it's just very intense. It means you have to look at more dimensions at the same time. You have to look in more integrated than ever, holistically. You have to start thinking and going to understand the market a bit earlier on. It's just that more intensity and more dimensions, I think. Yeah.
Okay. Thank you, Francois, and thank you, Akshay. So we have had another question come in. Have all contract examples been implemented or just discussed? Who would like to answer that one?
This is Akshay. I'd like to take on that question. So it's a very interesting question because let's take the Strimvelis example, which we showed. The Strimvelis deal was specific to IFA, but when they were trying to get access for patients from other markets, there were some elements of the contract that appealed to the markets or didn't appeal to the market. So, for example, in Germany, because they were dealing with just a handful of patients, the whole annuity-based payments wasn't well accepted. So that was one market where they stayed clear of the annuity-based scheme. Similarly, when we look at the Lexterna example, we talked about annuity-based payments. That was a specific deal to work with CMS, and that's been under discussion for a while. And there are certain implementation challenges around that in the American context, especially as these patients get the treatment and over time they move out from CMS coverage to, say, as they become older, they get jobs and get commercial plans. So how is the supportability going to work? So essentially, when companies are launching these products, they come up with a laundry list of, what are the different payers which we have and what are the challenges they may face using a payer archetype approach, and they develop a laundry list of different contracting solutions and depending on the payer type or the payer archetype, they select what works best in that context. So I hope that answers that question.
Lovely. Yes. Thank you, Akshay. So what new capabilities and skills are most needed from the biotech or pharma side? Francois, perhaps you'd like to answer that one?
Yeah, okay. I think Maya will have to add to that. I mean, the key thing is that you need somebody to be a center and coordinate. In a sense, the market access person function, for instance, would be a good example because, by definition, if you're in market access, and when you mean market access, we mean more than just pricing or reimbursement. Really, that's access physically to the patient as well. To be in that role, you need to understand everything is going on the market. You need to understand the complexity from regulatory, from manufacturing, from clinical, real-world aspects, and financials. That's what a good market access could do, but I think that they're probably not as challenged as they are now in this frame. So it's maybe more giving more scope and prominence and depth to the person that would be orchestrating, and from the market access point of view. But think of market access as something wider that's typically done. So I'm not quite sure if I answered the question fully, but I think it's more the emphasis have this almost a new role or a bigger role, although obviously it's just it's not one man band. We understand it's more about a person would feel responsible to be sure they understand the market enough that they have engaged all the stakeholders and go a bit beyond what's not normally done. Maybe Maya of Action want to add to it, or yeah.
Hi everyone, this is Maya here. So yes, I completely agree with what Francois just said. We need people to be able to think in a cross-functional manner. But it's quite interesting if you look at different players that are getting involved in this space. And I think one of the key capabilities that we need to develop in the market access space for cell and gene therapies is individuals that are able to think outside the box, perhaps bringing experience from even other industries and when they're faced challenges with disruptive technologies, and really pushing the bar and breaking out of some of the traditional thinking that we've typically done over the last couple of years.
Thank you very much, Maya. And what do you think is payer sentiment as regards cell and gene therapies?
Hi, Angela. I'll take that question as well. That's actually a really good question because, it's hard to speak for all the payers. So there are different groups of payers, some payer groups more advanced than others, and they understand the value of these technologies and are really working in a collaborative way with industry players, with consultants, really trying to understand how to create the right infrastructure to adopt these technologies. And then we also have some payers who are a little bit familiarized in the stages of familiarizing themselves with the technology and what it can bring to the market. But from an overall perspective, I would say most payers are really quite excited about the transformational potential of these technologies. But they also have some key concerns. The top one that we hear about a lot is evidence. Evidence, how do we believe, how do we know this is going to work, what evidence do we have? Is it a one-time cure? Is it something that's going to require retreatment? And then the other main question, which I think is not new to anyone really, is how do we afford, how do we pay for these technologies? How do we need to make our system more efficient? And where do we realize these efficiencies to channel the funding for these technologies? And I think they're really looking to the industry to work with them in a very collaborative and transparent fashion to work together and to really enable patient access for cell and gene therapies.
Thank you. And Francois, do you have anything to add to that?
No, I think it's a bit comprehensive answer. So.
Yeah, this is.
I think we have a few more questions coming in, but
we have got quite a few coming in.
Yeah, this is Akshay, and I think I'd like to add to Maya's point that yes, there is this excitement, but there's also the concern that ecosystem requires change, and the payers are recognizing this, and at the same time there are also affordability barriers, especially in the next few years with industry spate of these therapies coming into the market, and it's they are looking at alternative models of delivering these therapies, and they're also expecting industry over time to address some of the challenges around, especially the cost of these therapies. One of the big drivers for the costs has been COGS, and are we going to see evolution of technology that brings some of the COGS down? And recently, for example, we've seen Catapult in the UK, working with certain companies that manufacture technology for cell and gene therapies to try and see if the COGS element can be addressed, and the expectation is that would also translate into a reduction in prices for these therapies. So we have been talking about value-based pricing for quite a while. Payers recognize that they have to pay for value, but at the same time, given the spate and the practicalities of a lot of these therapies coming into the market at one time, are we going to start moving away from a value-based discussion to saying, okay, let's find a solution that works both for industry as well as for the health systems as well? So they are open to it, in short.
Okay. Thank you very much. As we said before, there are quite a lot of questions coming in. So if we don't get time to answer all of these today, then we will come back to these after the webinar. Please rest assured. So I'm going to take another one here. So do you have a view as to the potential impact of these high-priced medicines or on any co-pay arrangements?
Right. I guess the question is in the U.S. context, or maybe other countries when there is I think the question about patient co-pay.
Yes.
Is okay. So is that the case? Obviously, it's difficult to imagine a substantial co-pay to $1 million therapies. So even a small percentage is very high. So my view is that some special arrangement will have to be made. In some situation, healthcare system has catastrophic illness kind of coverage, which may reduce the burden. So, I think it's probably one of the way. However, if it comes to be a relatively more common, patient populations and more disease, I think that's effectively there will be a need for a new solution for that.
Okay, thank you. Do you think by advent of more therapies onto the market, these kind of challenges that we've been talking about fade away, or is this a case-by-case basis?
I think that's a very interesting question. So this is Akshay, and I'd like to take this on. I think, there will be, so when you start thinking of the challenges, there are product-specific challenges. Many of these products are launching with early data, limited data sets. That's very product specific, but there's some of the ecosystem challenges that burn some referral pattern, like we discussed during the webinar. As solutions start getting developed by different companies working in conjunction with the payers, it'll become a cost of entry requirement where companies will have to come in with these solutions. Also, there is certain ecosystem changes that will be required because healthcare systems traditionally have been geared towards treating rather than curing patients with one-off therapies. And if these therapies meet their promise of curing patients, for the want of a better word, it requires a change in mindset for a lot of healthcare stakeholders along the way. So, for example, certain specialty groups will become more relevant, especially if autologous and CAR-Ts take off. We need a lot more transplant specialists. We need more infrastructure to deliver these technologies and maybe move away from some of the more traditional specialties in terms of volume of physicians. So this will evolve over time. I don't see it happening immediately over the next 4 or 5 years. So in brief, yes, some of the issues will start fading away as companies start addressing some of the challenges. They become cost of entry requirements for other drugs. But then there's larger and longer term structural issues as well in the ecosystem, and that typically take longer to address, and it requires an evolution of the market.
Yeah, and I guess just to add to that point that Akshay made, I think the challenge is they won't necessarily go away, but just change in nature, where we'll go from, spending a lot of time trying to get the right environment, the delivery infrastructure, which is a long process. But then I guess when the space becomes competitive, then it'll become about differentiating your products and what uniqueness you're bringing to the market. So I feel that the challenges will change in nature, but like in any other space, continue to exist.
Yeah, just to add, I think it's a real long-term thing. It's a bit like the personalized medicines and this kind of futuristic vision when people will be treated based on genotypes. That's a very, very long-term vision. So, but effectively, I think the structural consideration are probably the most important because it's only when you have a good understanding of the value in the long term the healthcare system actually benefits for one of curative therapies. It's when incentives in the system are all aligned that's really the value propositions clicks in really full time. So, and that would take quite a few years.
Okay, thank you very much. I think if we're quick, we've got time for just one more question. So, talking about pharmacovigilance in gene therapy, what impact do the different aspects of gene therapy have?
That's a great question. Go ahead, Akshay.
Yeah, I think that's a great question. I think a lot of these therapies are launching because based on their promise and because they're targeting high unmet need populations. They're launching with limited data sets, and regulators are mandating collection of data, especially when you look at the history of gene therapy. The early gene therapies in the 1990s resulted in oncogenesis, and that's fear continues playing in the mind of the regulators, and to a large extent, even to some extent, with the payers as well. So the requirements are quite rigorous. Long-term data collection, having very clear data sets around the safety as well as the durability of effects of these drugs or the efficacy of these drugs over the long term. So the requirements are rigorous. At the same time, though, when you think of it from a patient's perspective, put yourself, say, in a hemophilia patient's shoes. You're offering them, suddenly telling them that there's this new therapy which you take one time and give you a cure. You won't need any other retreatment. It's very exciting for them, but at the same time, we're telling them that, there are going to be long-term follow-up requirements, there's a lot of data. And the incentives from the patient side are limited if we just stick to our traditional ways of collecting the data. And we have to now start thinking of more advanced ways, like using digital technologies to make it easy and reduce the burden on physicians and patients to collect data over the long term.
Okay, well, unfortunately, that's all the questions we have time for. Thank you again to our speakers, Francois, Lucas, Maya, Kurana, and Akshay Kumar from Huron. If we didn't get time to answer your question, we will come back to those after the webinar. This webinar will also be available to download from pharmaphile.com on demand shortly. I'd be grateful if you can remain connected for just a few more seconds, and you'll be redirected to our feedback survey, where you can submit any comments or further questions you might have. That's all from us. I'd just like to say a final thank you to all of our listeners for their time, and I hope you found it useful. I hope you'll join us again for future webinars.